And a very warm welcome to our 10th and final webinar in our webinar series here. My name is Frederick Nyberg. I'm the Managing Director for MedTech Innovator based here in Singapore. Um, as I said, it's the last webinar of our series. We've been doing 10 of these. This is our 10th and final webinar for this season. I think it's appropriate for us to perhaps wrap up on the topic of commercialization. We will speak today about managing sales and distribution channels for medtech companies, both in Asia Pacific and in the US. We have an outstanding panel joining us today, and I'll introduce them in just a second. Just as a quick background, we are live streaming this webinar on YouTube and on LinkedIn. And after the first hour, we will then go into closed door Q&A with our cohort companies. So although this is our last webinar for this season, do stay tuned for additional information coming your way on the upcoming MedTech Innovator Asia Pacific Grand Finals on the 5th and 6th of December. They'll take place here in Singapore. And of course, very shortly, there will be information coming out on our social media on our 2024 application cycle. So do stay tuned to that. A few words about MedTech Innovator very quickly for those of you who may not be familiar with who we are. We are the world's largest accelerator for startups in traditional medical devices, digital health, and in vitro diagnostics. We have by the end of this calendar year, we'll have well over 600 companies that have gone through the program. They've gone on to raise, I used to say 7 billion US in follow-on equity. We had an acquisition a week ago, so it is now 7.4 billion, I believe, in follow-on funding. And do join us at the APAC MedTech Forum and the Grand Finals in December. You will have the opportunity to meet all 24 companies then. A quick comment on logistics to our cohort companies that are online. I think by now you know the drill. Kindly queue up your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or just raise your hand, and we'll get to those questions at the top of the hour. So let me now turn to our panelists. I'm thrilled to introduce this panel to all of you. We have an outstanding number of speakers here. We have first Paul Paras from Teleflex, based in Sydney. Welcome, Paul. I'll get each of our panelists to introduce themselves in just a moment. So Paul is General Manager Commercial for Australia and New Zealand. We have Carlin Mak, based here in Singapore for Teleflex Singapore and Thailand. And joining us from the US, currently dialing in from Dallas, I believe, we have Ken Nelson. Welcome back, Ken. Great to have you on the panel. Ken, will introduce himself. He is currently the partner at the MedTech Advantage Fund, which is the fund that really recently announced fund that invests in MedTech Innovator alumni companies. But maybe even more relevant for today's panel discussion is he was the Chief Commercial Officer at Bardy Diagnostics, and he was the VP US Sales at Biotelemetry, which is now part of Philips. I will have each of our panelists briefly introduce themselves and tell us a bit about what you do, your company, your leadership background in sales, distribution, and medtech marketing. And I'll start with Paul.
Thanks, Frederick. So my name is Paul Paris. I am the General Manager for Teleflex and responsible for driving the strategic direction and the commercial activities across Australia and New Zealand. I've had more job titles than I do fingers and toes. I started my career over 20 years ago. I've worked in customer service, in operations, sales, corporate accounts, and various management roles in recent years. And thank you all for being here today, and I appreciate your time and attention.
Thanks. And Carlin.
So a very good morning or good evening to industry partners on the call. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. My name is Kalin Mak, and I'm currently leading the commercial team for both Singapore and Thailand as the regional head. I passed my 10.5 years in Teleflex since I joined straight from university and started my Teleflex journey as a sales rep in Singapore. So really through performance, I advanced covering 13 countries in Southeast Asia region as a product marketing and commercial lead. During that period, I actually executed new product launches and actually strategic initiative to go direct. I was promoted recently, say 2 years ago in 2021, as a regional head to lead the growth market in Thailand and Singapore. And currently, the business for both countries is a hybrid of mixed distributor management and direct business. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Colin. So we have experience here both of direct sales in Asia Pacific and indirect as well as hybrid setups. And Ken, please tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah, so I have a little bit atypical background. I started out in corporate finance, and then when 9/11 happened and the Twin Towers got hit in New York City, I decided to make a total career change and get into cardiac devices. First with Guidant in cardiac rhythm management and implantable pacemakers and defibrillators. They were eventually acquired by Boston Scientific, so kind of worked my way up from a sales rep into sales leadership. I was there for just under 10 years. And then I spent the next dozen or so years building the teams, the cultures, the infrastructures of what have become three of the four biggest players globally in cardiac digital health and remote patient monitoring. For all of those, I built the teams that launched their disruptive cardiac patch monitors, which are all their core products today for all of those companies. iRhythm eventually went public with market cap roughly 4 billion. Biotelemetry eventually got acquired by Philips for 2.8 billion. And then Bharti, which is where I kind of got my first interaction with MedTech Innovator and went through MedTech Innovator in 2019 as CCO of Bharti. Bharti got acquired 3 years later after commercializing them, really taking them from a couple hundred patients a month to 20,000 patients a month. We sold that company for 375 million in cash up front, and then 2 years of earnout. So all in about 500 million. And so have commercialized a number of different sales teams and launched a number of disruptive products, had direct teams, worked with distributors. So happy to discuss all of that. And then more recently have joined a half dozen disruptive cardiac startup boards around the world. I'm involved with a handful of different startup accelerators, including MedTech Innovator and the smaller Health Wildcatters in Dallas. I'm an angel investor and also helped start and lead the MedTech Advantage Fund with Paul Grand, Chris Neal, and Patrick O'Neill. So, Frederick, really appreciate you having us on here and happy to have this discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Ken. So we'll certainly I'll come back to you with your perspective on how a trade sale or an acquisition might impact commercial models and sales and distribution channels. Excellent, Carlin. Maybe let me turn to you first here in terms of when you've done a lot of work with distributor markets in the region. What are some of the basic commercial models for medical devices? We have obviously direct, we have indirect, we have hybrid. You've worked mostly with hybrid and with indirect. How do you typically determine what works best in any one market?
So this is a very good question. Thank you. So actually a medtech should really think about commercialization and go to market strategy early in the developing process, ideally from the very beginning. So it's very good to start asking questions, around, is there enough market research validation done? Did we consider the regulatory pathway or the quality compliance, clinical validation, and good insights on the reimbursement landscape of the technology? I think by considering all these factors early in your developing career, it will really help you better prepare and navigate the complexity of the healthcare industry and really increase your chances when it comes to commercialization and market access. Now, we really need to keep in mind the time and specific strategy that may vary across the nature of the medical technology target markets, regulatory environment that is really evolving in Southeast Asia. It's also important to continue adapting and refining those go-to-market strategies as the business starts evolving.
Right. Thanks for that, Carlin. Ken, when you were working on distributor markets outside of the US, and had to determine where you wanted to go direct, where you wanted to work through a network of distributors, how did you determine that? Was that a factor of the size of the market, the opportunity, the local presence of your own organization? Maybe give us some of your thoughts on that.
It just to give a couple of factors here. So obviously there's a lot of different factors to go into making that decision, and building a direct sales force is really expensive, both from a monetary standpoint and a time and energy standpoint to recruit, hire, develop those people. There's a lot of cost there in both time and money. I would say for me, at least in my experience and the businesses that I've been involved with, in your core market where your biggest opportunity is, I highly recommend, if you can do it, to build a direct sales force. That's going to be your best bet for success and to scale quickly. In ancillary markets where you may not have the best opportunity or the best profitability, but you still want to try to expand and have global expansion, you may want to start with a distributor network, especially if it's a market that you don't know as well, and try to tap into those local relationships through a distributor. So in general, that's what I would say. But over time, at least for me, I've had the most success with direct teams, especially in the US.
That's helpful, and that of course brings me to Paul. Tell us a little bit about your experience in working in direct sales, and I'll ask you as well, from Teleflex perspective, what Ken just mentioned here is that typically the thought process that Teleflex goes through before deciding on where to go direct and where to set up a distributor network, or other factors that play in?
Yeah, absolutely. In Australia and both New Zealand, we sell predominantly directly to the end user. That's largely been my experience also. When we think about what works best in a direct model, just that management over your customer relationships, being able to obtain feedback directly from the end user, having that direct access through doing things like voice of customer. And you really get to understand market insights and customer needs a lot better. And also that flexibility to offer customized solutions. For example, at Teleflex, we provide a range of laryngeal airways, and each customer and anaesthetist may have different preferences, such as first gen versus second generation, PVC versus silicon. So working with each stakeholder directly within an account allows you to offer those customized solutions. In a direct model, however, you also need to consider investment in headcount. Ken just touched on that, which could be sales, marketing, education type roles. And your costs might be higher initially as you begin penetrating that market. So I don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all approach. What works best may evolve over time when considering direct versus indirect versus hybrid approaches.
Yep, very, very helpful. And Ken, I'll turn to you for this. As you, again, going back to one of your previous roles where you did work outside of the US as well, and you were, of course, in the shoes of a startup more than once. For a startup, very often also has the option to just work with a single licensing partner. So you can build the sales channels, you can build the distribution channels, but there is the option, of course, of just finding a single partner and do a global licensing agreement. What's been your experience there, and what are some of the pros and cons of that versus actually building organically indirect or direct sales?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. For me, they've typically been either hybrid model, or we've actually done co-marketing agreements. And by co-marketing, I mean, like with iRhythm, we had two different partnerships. One was with McKesson for primary care, and then another was with St. Jude Medical, which is now Abbott, on the cardiology and electrophysiology side. And and we would go in with the Abbott St. Jude guys. We would go in together and kind of work in collaboration with that sales team. And it was a little bit different with our McKesson relationship. With McKesson, we would typically use them for more lead generation, and then they would hand those off to us. But we didn't do any pure licensing of the technology to a third party. So I don't have as much experience just purely licensing a technology to another player. What I'll say about that though is, man, you got to be really sure that that player is going to work out, because you're really putting all your eggs in one basket that you don't have any control over. So I would that would make me nervous if all my success hinged upon licensing a product to one player. Now, if it was you were just licensing it to many players, maybe that's a different story. But for me, just having had success with building teams and building cultures, and seeing that success of a direct team, I don't know. I'd love to hear the other panelists' perspective on that.
Paul, Carlin, any thoughts on that? I don't know if you've been involved in licensing arrangements at all.
I haven't, to be honest with you. So I'll just do what Ken says.
Yeah, no worries. I did want to, Paul, I'll stay with you for a second. Leadership qualities in sales and commercialization. You've been 2 decades in the industry, and what are some of those critical leadership qualities typically that you look for as you build a team, and do you see that those leadership qualities might be a bit different from what a startup might have, or what a startup might need?
Yeah, possibly. I think from my experience, I would suggest don't limit yourself to only looking at significant related experience in the industry. Or you'll see on job ads, relevant tertiary qualifications. So probably remove yourself from limiting yourself on those types of qualifications or skill sets. Keep yourself open-minded, and look for, for me, it's strong motivational and persuasive skills. Looking at communication and presentation skills also. Proven sales ability, are they well organized? And then tie them into core values and which you believe in. And at Teleflex, our core values are entrepreneurial spirit, it's trust, and it's make it fun. And that's what we also tend to seek out, tying into where your business values lie. And we spend so much time in our lives at the workplace, and finding the right people to surround yourself with to execute that strategy is important. So for startups specifically, for them, remaining resilient and adaptable are probably the two key things for me, along with having that customer-centric mindset, which focuses on patient outcomes.
Yeah, great points there. So we'll come to working with distributors in more detail in just a moment, and I'd love to have Carlin's input on some of that. I just wanted to very quickly ask Ken, while we're still talking about general commercial models, in the US there is something known as, I understand, independent sales reps, 1099s. And I think some of our startups may have come across that. Maybe you can just tell us a bit about what they are, how do they work, and do they work for medtech startups?
So they're think about them as independent contractors that can be on your sales team, and you can have a mix of direct and independent reps. And in some companies that works out. I think a lot of times earlier stage companies might do that because it's those reps sometimes will work on 100% commission, or mostly commission versus salary. So it's kind of a what they would refer to as eat what you kill type of salesperson, where they're only getting paid if they sell something. And so that is appealing in some respects. In other respects, if they have lots of different products that they're an independent rep for, you have no idea how much time they're spending selling your particular product. So it really just depends on if you get those independent reps to 100% be focused on your product, then I think your success rate is probably going to be higher.
Mm.
If they're repping 20 different companies' products, it just becomes a lot more challenging. But I've seen some companies commercialize using a full sales force of independent reps like that, 1099 reps. For me, I've always preferred direct. So even if I've inherited a team of independent reps with direct reps, I've always tried to transition, at
Mm.
least for the U.S. sales force everybody to direct. But again, when it comes to money and trying to build a sales force, if you don't have the funds to build a full direct sales force, it's definitely an option to consider, especially in ancillary markets where you may need somebody who has those relationships, and you just don't have the funds to hire a direct rep. You could start with that independent rep and then transition to a direct rep. So it's a good option just to have and consider for different markets.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Paul, is this a concept that exists in Australia and New Zealand?
I've not heard of. Is it 1099s can refer to? And we do though look at to engage with contractors at time. So I mean, I guess the positives reading from what Ken was saying is, cost savings. And for us, we utilize contractors for specific skill sets that we don't have within the organization. So, for example, navigating MSAC applications. MSAC in Australia stands for the Medical Services Advisory Committee, and they make decisions on how medical services are funded. And it's not something necessarily that we have that skill set and we would look to engage, 1099s, as Ken mentions.
I don't know if that's a tax code or where that number comes from, but
I think it is a tax code. It's funny. It's just
everyone refers to them as 1099s. Carlin, in your markets, do you work with independent reps at all, or is it mostly full distributor organizations and they have their own sales teams and clinical specialists?
Actually, you know what? Okay, so 10 years ago, when we established the Southeast Asia region, they do exist in APAC. They bring up local market insights, product expertise, and existing customer network. So what we do is that those markets that doesn't have any local entity, we can't employ someone direct. So we actually engage independent consultants or sales reps to lead and manage the distributor in view of the complexity, the language, the cultural sensitivity, that barrier that can be addressed at those, we call it country managers contracts. So yeah, we do start up 10 years ago with Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, before we set up local entities and scale up to transit into the direct business. But it has to start from somewhere. And that's where we started.
Yeah, understood. And that's maybe a good segue to the next section here of our discussion. How do you find distributors? And I'll stay with Carlin here for a second. So how do you find a distributor? How do you find an independent rep, whatever you choose to work with? How does that work? The Teleflex, maybe draw on your past experience in other parts of Southeast Asia. Is it just a matter of going out to a trade show and an exhibition and sign someone up who comes along and seems interested, and especially if you're a smaller company that may not have a strong brand like Teleflex, where do you find these distributors?
So I typically start with speaking to the local key opinion leaders, those early adopters that already have interest in your product, and ask for recommendations. So end of the day, actually, your customers will have their preference on which distributor they want to work with. So exhibition and trade shows do have their values. There's a lot of potential partnership gathered in one venue to compare around the distributor options and a really good understanding of their existing portfolio and how your product can synergize or fit into their current portfolio. But I tend to go towards the customers because they are more honest and they give the real feedback and insight on which distributor should complement your product or really have a good relationship and reputation in the market. So it's best to go straight to your customers.
I think that's great advice, and certainly when I've been doing sales marketing, distribution in medical sales myself, that's always been the best approach because you when you speak to the end user, you speak to the clinicians, get their recommendations, who do they want to work with. I think that's an important takeaway here for our audience. Um, Kenny, when you worked with distributors in your past life, um, typically what's the key value that you see the distributors bring? Is it all about just generating sales, or is it also about payment collection, holding inventory? Are there other roles that a distributor typically plays? I know you've done a lot of work in Europe in the past, for instance.
Yeah, I mean it just depends on the distributor and the market, but I can tell you one of the startups I'm on the board of now, they did a commercial distribution agreement with a big pharmaceutical company in India, and that company is not only going to commercialize the product, but they're funding the clinical studies and helping to get it through the India FDA, the regulatory and compliance of India. So in that particular case, it seems like, at least so far, a great partnership. And I'll give you the kind of the flip side of that. In another startup that I was commercializing, when I got there, they already had a distributor in place, and it wasn't necessarily working out as we had hoped. And they had helped get the clearance for our product in those a couple different countries, and it became really difficult to transfer that over to the next distributor back to the company. So one of the lessons we learned there is, depending on if you're doing a distribution agreement with a major company versus maybe a few people who are part of a small distribution group, you need to be really careful if it's the smaller distribution group, because they may make it very difficult for you to transfer that license and regulatory approval from that distributorship back to the company or to another distributorship as you try to transition to another distributor. So that was one of the things that we learned the hard way in that process. But we got through it and learned in other countries to not do it that way, and that we made sure that even if they did the work, we needed the license to be in our name.
Yeah, I think that's great advice as well. Thanks for that, Ken. And I'll be interested in Colin's perspective on this. I spent a few years working in Japan with distributors, and there are frankly some horror stories about how that transition from one distributor to another
Yes.
does not work, because they essentially hold you hostage.
Yeah.
With that regulatory approval. Carlin, your experience in that area.
Yeah, I think we all been through the same experience. There are times where when we actually do not own the license, it's the hostile termination situation where they are not willing to transfer those licenses, and it results in a lot of significant loss of revenue, really forcing your products to exit the market. You go through that whole re-registration of the product, takes about 6 to 12 months. And before your product can enter the market again, this gap really allows the distributors to pivot and take on a competitor product as an alternative. And worst case scenario, if your product is in the tenders or contract, they can easily substitute the product with the competition. The consequences are real, after a long period of absence, and pose a lot of challenges, So it's really advisable to manage your own regulatory approvals and own those licenses.
Yeah, great advice. Carlin, I wanted to get your perspective as well on I don't know to what extent you've worked with multi-tier distributor networks. Maybe Southeast Asia, it's less common, but certainly places like China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, you've got multiple tiers of distributors that add a whole different level of complexity. Is that something you've come across?
Yes, certainly do. I think when we actually look at the multi-tier distributors, right, what happens is actually the territories of certain markets, there's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, And the typical strong distributors usually only consolidate the resources and focus in the capital cities or the metro cities. So in order to tap into the tier two and tier three accounts, they have to engage sub-dealers or distributors that are more effective to add more additional coverage. However, actually, in the recent trend in Southeast Asia, there's an increasing where over the last 5, 6 years, where distributors, the main distributors, start acquiring those sub-distributors and scale up their operations within those countries and establish offices in those territories. This brings a lot of benefits, because you don't want to have multiple markups and really cutting the multiple tiered cost and reduce the end cost of the customers. So your product pricing will be more competitive and affordable to the customers if you have a consolidated one distributor network across one country.
Great point. And this whole topic of distributor consolidation is one. I think we see it maybe more in some markets than others. China, the Chinese government announced the two invoice policy a few years ago, and there used to be well over 100,000 medical device distributors in China alone, which of course was a problem with everyone wanting a cut of the margin. So you can understand why governments are trying to force consolidation as well. Paul, do you see in Australia and New Zealand trends in the distributor medical device distributor environment that do you see consolidation in that area, or do you see the distributors essentially having their carved out sectors of the market?
In terms of trends with hospital purchasing, you're referring to, or?
Well, maybe more in terms of whether you have fewer medical device distributors today than maybe you had 10 years ago, because there is a consolidation and more companies are doing what Teleflex is doing by going direct.
Yeah, certainly. It's I mean, for me personally, I came from an acquisition. So I was 10
Okay.
years ago, Teleflex came direct. When I started 20 years ago, I was working for the distributor that was supplying the surgical portfolio that now Teleflex goes direct with. So, and it has been a change. You have seen it's more and more common that companies are going direct, taking products on and kind of cutting out the middleman.
Yeah. Ken, for almost all, not all, but almost all of the cohort companies that are on this webinar are based outside of the US. If they are looking to build some sort of a commercial setup in the US market, any advice you can give non-US medtech startups as they look at their commercial options in the US? One distributor, multiple distributors? Do they focus on making sure that they get the right coverage? Do they focus on selecting someone that has the right clinical specialization? Some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I guess it depends if the US is their best opportunity and going to be their core market, then my answer would be one thing. And if it's an ancillary market, maybe not their best opportunity, then the answer may be, yeah, you go the distributor route. If it's going to be their core market and it's their most profitable opportunity, I would highly suggest that they consider building a direct sales team. How do you find that direct sales team? I would use the MedTech Innovator Network and ask to try to get in touch with some of the better recruiters out there. You've got people like Giovanni Loricella from Lifeblood Capital, who's really good at networking and finding commercial talent, and it all starts with the commercial leader. There's other really good recruiting groups out there as well, and happy to share those or talk to Paul or Catherine. We can share some of the ones that are tied into MedTech Innovator, ones that we've used in the past that do a really nice job. But part of it is finding the right sales and commercial leader who's going to set the tone, build the right culture, find the right people. And for me, people and culture were always the the magic ingredient that made these companies do really, really well. And that's something I learned early on from, was lucky and had great mentors at Guidant that just really focused on people and culture and did an amazing job. And the culture at Guidant was incredible. And I think when you focus on that and you find the right commercial leader who's going to build that culture and find the right talent, that just really makes all the difference in the world. So I'd find a good recruiter and then really focus on finding that good US based sales leader who has the network to recruit people that have worked for them before and to kind of build it.
Yeah, yeah. Good advice. And Colin, coming back to Asia Pacific and Southeast Asia, there are a few different ways, of course, that a company can build a distribution structure, and you can either go sort of country by country, or you have some of the regional distributors. You got the Zuellig Pharma and the DKSH, and some of them are pure logistics companies. Some of them cover multiple countries. What are some of the pros and cons, and why would a company choose to have specific individual distributors in some markets, or choose to have a single regional distributor, maybe that covers all of Southeast Asia? Do they even exist?
Yeah, actually, we did really consider all three factors when we decide to commercialize a product. I think the choice between the two factors, or two options, depends on many factors, including your business goal, the nature of your product, your resources, and specific dynamics of the market that you are targeting. So fewer large distributors like the Zuellig or the DKSH brings centralized control, really good effective management on smaller distributor channels, a broader outreach to scale up very quickly, and really streamline established operations. However, typical large distributors have limited market expertise as compared to the smaller distributors that are best in their individual market. The competition for attention, since they have a large portfolio of products the distributor represents, is also something that actually will not drive focus if your product requires a lot of in-depth training and actually follow up. A large distributor may have established processes but rigid terms that really limits your ability to adapt to the market changes quickly. So in comparison, the smaller distributors often have deep understanding of the local market, customer preference, and really a stronger network per se, actually, in terms of the customer pool that you want to go for. The regulatory requirements, they are more familiar because they are locals, and they actually carry only limited product range. That means that your product is more likely to receive dedicated attention and focus. Now, smaller distributors can pivot really fast. They are more adaptable to the changes in the market condition and the customer demand. However, managing many smaller distributors can be challenging and really time-consuming. There's also a potential of inconsistency around the branding and pricing strategy. Let's say, actually, if we have one distributor in every country, everybody price the product very differently, and leads to really inconsistency in your product present to the customers. If your end goal is to rapidly expand to multiple markets, managing multiple small distributors may not be as effective as working with a few larger ones. So ultimately, like what Paul and Ken say, there's no one size fits all. So it's really about involving both to balance out the reach and the market expertise.
Right. Great point, Colin. Thanks for that. And before we go into purchasing practices, I want to talk a little bit about that as well. I wanted just to turn to Ken and knowing that you've gone through multiple trade sale exits or acquisitions. How has that affected sales and distribution management in those companies? And typically when a company is about to be acquired during a trade sale, what is being looked at as part of the due diligence, and what are possible red flags that a buyer might look at in an organization?
Yeah, so I think we had the most activity when I was kind of over M&A, business development, and also sales at BioTelemetry, where we acquired a handful of different competitors. And so when you're doing that, the reasons you buy those competitors can be varied. And as part of the diligence process, at least for me, is I'm always really interested in the people. Like, what are how good are the people that you're inheriting? Who are you going to want to retain? Who are you going to really fight to retain? How are the cultures going to mix or not mix? And are you really going to be able to integrate that team into what you've already built and be successful, or you're going to have to operate the two units kind of independently and try to integrate them over time, or really never integrate them and have them both run independently over time. There's a lot of different things to consider, and then what parts of those organizations can you do you have synergies where you can maybe eliminate the finance group from one team, and obviously you want to cut costs wherever you can, and consolidate teams as best you can, and then optimize those teams. So a lot of it just depending on what type of company that you're acquiring. If it's a competitive product, do you want to keep that product on the market and keep those people? If it's an ancillary or complementary product, is that going to be distracting to selling your core business? Is it going to take away from the sales of your core business? Is it going to cannibalize any of your core business? And so you really have to take all those factors into consideration through that whole process.
Got it. Got it. Thanks for that. Let's talk a bit about purchasing and purchasing processes and trends maybe in group purchasing and so on. And Paul, I'll turn to you on this. In Australia, a lot of people that doing business in Australia, they've heard of the prosthesis list, for example. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what that is and the relevance, and more generally in terms of purchasing, broader purchasing trends in medtech in Australia and New Zealand, group purchasing and those sorts of activities. What's your perspective from down under?
Yeah, let's touch on both. And the prosthesis list is an interesting one down under, but there are a number of trends in Australia and New Zealand, or down under, like you say, such as an aging population. There's group purchasing models in private health, which are aggregating purchasing power. Digital transformation, like e-commerce models, are becoming more common in Australia. But like you've mentioned, the one getting the most attention right now is the prosthesis reforms. So the prosthesis list sets the prices paid by private health insurers, which are for prosthetic devices, specifically in private health. And we're roughly 50-50 private versus public health in Australia. And some of the challenges industry are navigating at the moment are price reductions across a range of products that have been enforced upon us by the prosthesis list. There's been removal of certain categories from the prosthesis list, whereby from the 1st of July in 2024, hospitals will need to negotiate with private insurers on what that reimbursement will look like in certain circumstances. And the other big change coming up as well with these reforms is around cost recovery fees. So, for example, it would cost us approximately $800 to list an item on the prosthesis list. And that's depending on the class of device. It could be costing companies in excess of $20,000 to list in the future. So some significant reforms presenting themselves in Australia at the moment.
Understood. And Ken, in the US, what are the purchasing high level purchasing trends there that a non-US company should be aware of in terms of group purchasing activity
so depending on the type of product, you're starting to see a lot more activity in ambulatory surgery centers, depending on the procedure or the technology, and same with what they refer to as OBLs, or office-based labs, where you're now able to do some implant procedures in the physician's office. So you're seeing more contracting directly with an office or an ambulatory surgery center. In terms of group purchasing organizations and IDNs, I still feel like GPOs, the value is not really that high. It's kind of a price to play scenario, but they're not great at driving compliance. But at the IDN level, just below the group purchasing organization level, or the integrated delivery network, the big, larger hospital groups like HCA or Kaiser, contracting with them, they have a much better track record in terms of driving compliance. And so if you do contract, they're a lot better at actually driving towards those market share commitments. And definitely well worth it if you can get on some of those IDN contracts like HCA or Kaiser. Now, some of those come with a cost of really low aggressive prices. But if they can drive the compliance, it can be a real game changer for your company, especially a growing startup.
Yeah, good point. And Carl, in the markets where you're working either now or previously, do you see is tender business, does that dominate what you do typically, and or is that something that you only see on the public hospital side and in some of the markets? What are some of the higher level purchasing trends you see in Southeast Asia?
I think very similar to some of the other markets. Tender processes is very common in hospital purchasing, mainly in the public sector. This actually, the challenge is around complexity, procurement regulation. It depends on, let's say, Singapore and Thailand. Singapore goes into the e-platform to submit tenders and the whole process is online. While in Thailand, you actually have to drive and go to the hospital, submit those documents on hard copy, and translation in local language support. That requires a local sales rep. Okay, so Singapore actually adopted this GPO model to achieve better cost saving due to bulk purchase. It puts a lot of pressures for vendors like us to drive down prices, and they try to consolidate. So I would say Singapore for the last 5 years, there's 18 government hospitals, and now tenders are caught consolidating 18 hospitals as a nationwide tender. So it's the same amount of volume, but actually there's only one decision, and it's centralized decision making and increased purchasing influence on decisions.
And if I understand the Teleflex product line, you also have capital equipment, although much of what you do is in the area of disposable devices. But correct me if I'm wrong, Paul. You do have capital equipment as well, and how do the selling cycles there typically differ in your markets?
Yeah, so we do an aortic balloon pump in terms of capital equipment and some other bits and pieces also. And capital equipment tends to be longer. However, it's not always the case. You shouldn't assume that it's longer selling capital equipment. I recall an example with a consumable device taking 3 years to be approved in our public health system. And that's even with having a key surgeon driving that request on our behalf. So it wasn't driven by Teleflex, it was a surgeon, and that consumable took 3 years. So staying close with your stakeholders will give you a better indication on those timelines and that selling cycle. Your KOLs, your clinical staff, your nurses, nurse unit managers, hospital administrators that control budgets. You've got infection control departments. So they're the type of people that will give you a better indication on the selling cycle and the timelines.
Yeah, and for some of the higher end interventional devices that you mentioned that I guess typically would never go through a tender process, what is typically the selling cycle there, and how does that work?
Yeah, so we don't normally see them go through a tender process. We do see the odd one.
You mentioned, I think, intra-aortic balloon pump, for example, or something along those lines.
No, absolutely. We do a lot around education, and we have a clinical medical affairs team that do a lot of education in field and work closely with our sales team in terms of working through the right timing to provide a sales quotation and look at the customer's needs accordingly. So in terms of the timelines around there, we've had examples where we will put a quotation in and within 24 hours the purchase order is sitting in our inbox. And we've got opportunities sitting in our funnel that have been there for 2 or 3 years that we're still working on. So quite a few variables in that.
Understood. Ken, for a company that's based here in Asia Pacific, how can they get connected to a hospital in the US? Can they do that directly? Just knock on the door and talk about what they have to offer? Do they have to go through a distributor? Are there other intermediaries that are worth engaging? What are some of your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think both of the ways that you mentioned, you can go through a distributor or you can just go directly to those hospitals. Another way to do it is to try to get one of the bigger hospital system venture groups to be an investor in your company, and that's another way to get
That's a good point.
some
Yeah.
warm introductions into hospital systems or LPs that may be invested in that hospital system. Venture fund for me, just to give you a couple of positive experiences, we had Rex Health Ventures, which is part of UNC, and Rex Health in the Carolinas. They were an investor. Ascension Ventures was an investor, and Health Enterprise Partners were all investors in Bardi. And they at least were able to make introductions to the right people. They could never guarantee you'd get the business, but they could at least give you a warm introduction into the right people in those hospital systems, and they'd at least give you a fair look. So that's one way to do it. If you don't have relationships in the country yet, the fastest way to do it would probably be to do it through some type of a distributor, just to get people to start trying your product.
Yeah. Good advice there. And in terms of the venture funds, how common is that in the US? Do all major hospital groups have their own investment fund and invest in medical technologies?
I would say it's becoming more and more common where the larger hospital systems, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, Ascension, HCA, Kaiser, all of the bigger systems in the US all have a separate venture group. And then surprisingly, some of the payers now, like Cigna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Optum slash United, they all have venture groups as well. And even some of the pharmacies, CVS, they have their own venture groups now and are investing in technologies and medical devices and digital health. So there's a lot of investors now who can be partners in terms of distributing the product or trying the product.
Yeah, running pilots and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Quick reminder to our cohort, please queue up your questions using the Q&A function or raise your hand and we'll get to your questions here in just a minute. I wanted to touch briefly on compliance. It's compliance, anti-bribery, anti-corruption issues can be a bit of a challenge, especially in distributor-led markets. I be interested to maybe get Teleflex thoughts on this, on how do you ensure compliance of, and I'll turn to Carlin here perhaps, how do you ensure that your distributors are compliant? And then I'll turn to Ken. How do you see the lack of compliance being a potentially huge issue during a future trade sale? And is it something, therefore, that an early stage company should start to think about now to make sure that they don't get caught with those sorts of issues possibly in their books? Carlin, maybe first your thought on compliance and keeping your distributors in check.
So actually, in Teleflex, we have an established platform to screen distributors onboarding, and there's regular compliance training to the distributors that they adhere to, and it's renewed yearly actually. So there's a platform called SecurityMed that every distributor has to be on board, provide all the details in terms of financials and legals and reputations. All this information has to be in the platform and updated regularly. So as for the startup operating in the healthcare industry, there's a lot of regulatory scrutiny and ethical consideration that is very paramount. So compliance is even more critical. So it's always very strict on, we recently learned about Vietnam, where actually one of the distributors got being removed from the market and delisted because of some compliance activities. And it hurts where vendors actually work with this partner. So I think this is largely critical because you invest a lot and build a lot and you just not to distribute.
Yeah. Great point. Ken, is this something a company should be concerned about and plan for as if they're looking for a trade sale exit one day?
I think it goes back to again, like really taking your time, doing your homework, and finding the right group that you can trust. Because if something does go sideways, it's reputational risk that's at stake, and you can have a really difficult time getting back into that country and commercializing in a country if you have somebody breaking the rules, the compliance rules, and it becomes a problem either with whatever the local regulatory group is, or worse, they fine you and don't let you distribute product in that country going forward or for a period of time. So you just need to be careful, just like when you're hiring your direct sales force, you want to make sure you're hiring the right people and building that right culture of following compliance. But again, at the end of the day, things can happen, and you just have to do your best to find people that hopefully you can trust and don't purposely break compliance rules. If they're purposely breaking compliance rules, then you can obviously have a big problem.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And I think many on the call here probably heard about the ongoing challenges in the Chinese market, where the Chinese government are cracking down on this, and the implications that has on not just the healthcare industry, but many industries in China. Gentlemen, I realize this hour went by very quickly. I will, as we wrap up, turn to each of you maybe for a few final words of advice, given that you now have an audience of startup founders, CEOs here on the call, the majority of whom have not yet started their commercialization, the majority of whom are not yet on the market. Final words of advice as they start to think about their commercialization, and Paul, I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the very first thing comes to people and culture, but Ken touched on that a bit earlier. So I might just back off that because I'm sure he might have a word or two to say about people and culture, but the people you surround yourself with, for me, is so important. I think for me also, it's seeking advice and asking questions. You don't know what you don't know. And the more you speak with experts in the field, being healthcare professionals or regulatory consultants or colleagues in the industry, that will be invaluable. So remain curious and continue learning.
Remain curious. I like that. Thanks, Paul. Carlin, your thoughts?
So I think to write on Paul's excellent comments, I think the journey of product commercialization is a marathon, not a sprint. Really to be prepared for ups and downs. Learn from the failure stories. They can help you better than the success stories. And really to learn to pivot and adapt to the changing circumstances. I think last but not least, really to stay committed, and really success often comes to when people persevere and continue to learn and innovate.
Good point. Thank you, Carlin. And Ken, you get the final closing words here on.
Yeah, sure. Just to add to the great comments that Paul and Carlin just mentioned, and obviously I talked earlier about the focus on people and culture, but it really comes down to passion, perseverance, and finding the right people and building the right culture. I think those 4 key things: people, passion, culture, and perseverance, and that's a good formula for success.
Excellent. Thank you. All 3 panelists, Paul, Carlin, Ken. Really, it was great discussion. We could have easily continued for another hour. Really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and insights. Stay on the line. Don't hang up. We will extend our thanks to our YouTube viewers at this time. Stop our live stream, and we'll go into close.